Okay, so hopefully that works. It's setting it up. All right, it looks like it went live on the Facebook page there. So
let's see.
There's like a 20-second lag, so it might look weird if you're looking along.
Okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, here we go.
Okay, awesome. And then this is on as Tri-City Collective. Okay, cool. So Autumn, are you good to go? Are you okay if I just hand over the hosting duties to you? And
yep, I'm good to go.
right, awesome. Thanks so much. So I'll log off. I'll keep an eye on the questions. Thanks again, everyone.
Welcome.
Let's see, leave meeting, and then assign a new host. All right, thanks again, everyone.
All right, good afternoon, and welcome to today's Real Talk on environmental justice. Real Talk, Voices from the Margins is produced by the Woody Guthrie Center, the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, Folk Alliance International, the Black Wall Street Times, and the Tri-City Collective. My name is Autumn Brown, and I will serve as today's host and moderator. I'm a doctoral candidate at Oklahoma State University with a focus on social foundations in education, and I am a member of the Tri-City Collective, an organization founded in 2016. Our work is driven by a passion for social justice and creative expression as we aim to provide learning opportunities and artistic opportunities outside of the classroom for youth and adults. Tulsa remains a segregated city, but we often ignore the connection between segregation and the environment. So today, our virtual Real Talk will feature 4 experts whose knowledge can help address these issues. So please join me in welcoming Maggie Chamberlain. Maggie is a third-year PhD student and graduate teaching assistant in the sociology department at Oklahoma State University. Maggie's research interests include environmental justice, hazards and disasters, social movements, social media, and geospatial methods. She is Oklahoma State's first recipient of the William Averett Anderson Fund Fellowship. Her dissertation will focus on understanding the impact of natural and technological disasters on different populations. Chamberlain currently serves as the sociology graduate student SGA president. Also joining us is Carly Griffith Hotvet. Carly is a citizen of Cherokee Nation and a seasoned legal professional admitted to practice in Oklahoma, Cherokee Nation, and Muskogee Creek Nation, with an affinity for government law, agriculture, tribal policy, administration, and in her current role as Director of Tribal Enterprise with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, she works with tribes and in tribal policy to advance food security and tribal agriculture and enterprise development. Prior to joining IFAI, she created and directed the Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources at Muskogee Creek Nation, where she initiated an overhaul of the agribusiness operation, resulting in a 70% loss margin reduction and set the program on track for profitability. Carly clerked for the late Oklahoma Supreme Court Justice Marian Opala while in law school, in addition to municipal internships with the city of Lawton and the city of Norman. She maintains a perfect success record for summary judgment motions in Oklahoma District and federal court. She has a 100% success rate in the courts of Cherokee Nation. Next, we have Nancy Moran. Nancy has served as a public health nurse for over 23 years and is a fellow with the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, focusing on environmental justice and air pollution in Tulsa. She serves as co-coordinator of Tulsa Ready for 100, which is part of a national movement of people working to inspire local leaders to embrace a vision of healthier communities powered with 100% clean, renewable energy. Nancy is a member of the MetCare Environmental Justice Team, which is currently focused on climate justice and increasing access to weatherization and energy efficiency. updates for Tulsans who are challenged with energy insecurity. As a City of Tulsa data pioneer volunteer, she co-led the effort to complete the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy's Clean City Energy Scorecard, which enables cities to measure their progress and identify policies and programs that save energy, promote renewable energy, and reduce greenhouse emissions. She is passionate about community gardening and enjoys connecting to the earth and other people at the Vernon AME Garden on Greenwood Avenue. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Anna Zeta. Dr. Zeta is an assistant professor of history at Oklahoma State University. She researches and teaches on environmental history, food studies, history of science, and environmental and food justice. Dr. Zeta is also a co-organizer of the OSU Food Studies program. Her first book, Canned: The Rise and Fall of Consumer Confidence in the American Food Industry, won the prestigious James Beard Award in 2019. She's now working on a second book project on the history of food waste in America, seeking to understand how political, economic, and cultural changes in the 20th century have led to a situation where we waste 40% of all food, producing 8% of greenhouse gases that contribute to the climate crisis, and deepening problems of hunger and food injustice in our nation. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in today's Real Talk on environmental justice. Just from reading you ladies' bios, I can tell that this is going to be a really fruitful and important information today. So I wanted to start with the history of environmental justice and food injustice. And Dr. Zeta, would you like to pick up there?
Thank you, Autumn, for the introduction. And I'll do my best to stay within my 10 minutes, but I also wanted to start with a quick kind of anecdote that I've been thinking on a lot in the last few weeks. Just this semester, I taught my just basic US history survey course since the Civil War. And it's a 230 some student class, huge survey, a lot of uninterested freshmen in the class, unfortunately. And I got my evaluations at the end of the semester. And largely, I was really pleased to see kind of that students seemed to get a lot out of the class. But there was this one particular review that has stuck with me, and I've been thinking a lot about it. And I wanted to read it out loud and to connect it to environmental justice here, in an obvious way, I think. And it says, this reminds me of those things, I don't know if you've seen, where celebrities read bad reviews of themselves or mean things people say on Twitter. So I'll try to not get emotional, but after a few weeks, it got really annoying because it felt like all we talked about was racism. Yes, that's an important part of history and such, but there is more to our history than racism, and I was interested to learn about it had it been taught. Even the last lecture over Hurricane Katrina talked about how the hurricane highlighted the disparities and racisms from white people to Black people, and that was all that was discussed about it. How are hurricanes tied to racism, especially hurricanes that happen in regions where the populations are largely minorities? Is Mother Nature racist now? Other than that, she did a good job making historical stories, the few that didn't revolve around racism, interesting. So anyway, I read this and part of me felt kind of proud because, these are the kind of students that at least it seems like they're reaching a sense of what I'm trying to put out there, which is that you can't really tell US history or history in general without engaging deeply with the historical foundations of race and racism in our country, and especially as the review gets to in the end, that a lot of this racism plays out in environmental terms, in terms of land displacement, of ownership, of agricultural production, all of these things that are so intimately tied with environment and race. And that question, is Mother Nature racist now? I just thought I need to write a book called that, or I need to teach a class called that, because, in some ways it couldn't better capture what we're trying to talk about today, which is that, of course, Mother Nature herself isn't racist, but who and what and how Mother Nature affects most harmfully has nearly everything to do with human structural political decisions, many of which are rooted in deeply racist policies, where different communities are built, how some people live in more low-lying areas than others, how that affects them when there comes to be hurricanes or tornadoes, how polluting industries are sited. All of these things determine how environmental harm is disproportionately given out, so to speak. So I wanted to start with that and to say that I think that history really matters. I mean, I'm a historian, so obviously I think so, but I think understanding sort of where these institutions are built, it's been really interesting recently, both with COVID-19 and the pandemic and recent protests against racial injustice. It seems like there has been more attention to how historically rooted. You can't understand any of this without understanding Jim Crow, without understanding redlining, all of these really critical historical practices. So in the case of environmental justice, and I'll speak a little to food justice too, because that's even more closely in some ways what I work on. Although I would say that the kind of campaigns for against environmental injustices go back quite deep. I mean, I think we could find instances that relate to it in some way for more than a century. The biggest movements, which have been led largely by Black, Indigenous, and people of color throughout the 20th century, sort of begin as a lot of these stories with the movements in the 1960s to recognize civil rights and environmental issues and how they intertwine together. Everything from Cesar Chavez's work with Latino farm workers and pesticide pollution in California to a well-known case in Houston where Black residents tried to stop a garbage dump that was being built. And one of the activists in that case was Robert Bullard, who kind of has come to be known as the father of environmental justice. He calls himself an accidental environmentalist, but he was pulled in by this very local case to start writing and talking and educating about environmental justice more broadly. But the kind of really landmark story that brought environmental justice to the national stage, and of course, I'm talking from an American perspective, but there's many really important international foundations of environmental justice work. But in the US, Warren County, North Carolina, 1982 is the case that's often attributed with bringing environmental justice to the federal attention, to national attention. And in that case, the state of North Carolina wanted to gather up all of this PCB contaminated soil from the roadways of different parts of the state and then truck all of this contaminated soil and put it in Warren County, which of course was one of the three, or I think few counties in the state with a majority Black population. And the decision-making that goes into this question of where these hazardous materials are dumped, where landfills are built, where polluting industries are built, has everything to do with a sense of where the least political and social capital exists, where people are least likely to fight, to not have the resources and the money and the time and the energy to do the fighting, the kind of not in my backyard NIMBYism that has prevented the siting of a lot of polluting industries in more well-off and often wider neighborhoods is thought to not exist as strongly in these neighborhoods. Thankfully, that has not always been the case. But in any case, in that case, the state did end up dumping the PCB soil, but the protests, there were many activists who stopped the trucks entering Warren County. This brought to the national attention this question of environmental racism. And you start to have lots of reports coming out in the late 80s from the federal government, the General Accounting Office, and then the United Church of Christ creates a landmark report in 87, which documents what the close alignment between hazardous waste sites and Black communities throughout the country, showing with really hard data the correlation between those things. And that kind of leads into the 1990s, where the environmental justice organizations start to look for allies within mainstream environmental organizations, calling out major groups like the National Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, a lot of these mainstream environmental organizations for having a history of racism in those environmental organizations. Unfortunately, many of the kind of fathers of environmentalism, John Muir, Henry David Thoreau, others wrote really disparagingly of Black and Indigenous peoples. Madison Grant, who was one of the major conservationists of the early 20th century, was also a leading proponent of eugenics and inspired Hitler and other white nationalist groups. And so these environmental justice groups pointed to these mainstream environmental organizations and said, you have racial bias in how you're developing policy. You have almost no people of color on your staffs. You are not paying attention to the places where we live, work, and play. That's kind of a major theme of environmental justice, is not just nature out there in the wilderness, in the protection of, you know, mountains and endangered species and water, all of which is critical, but also ignores where we live, work, and play, the communities and environments that are part of our everyday in more urban and suburban settings. So this leads in 1991 to the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. So this is, you know, almost 30 years ago. And even now, 1991 doesn't seem so long ago to me, but thinking that these issues have been not just talked about, but on national stage for 30 years, and yet we're still having to, you know, redefine and begin the conversation today, I think really gives a sense of just how slow the progress is, how deeply rooted the activism is, but the attention that's given to it and the policy change has been slower to follow. So just to conclude, I think today the environmental justice movement is really expanding its categories to think about climate justice, which several of our speakers can talk about, as the effects of the climate crisis continue to deepen, that again, poor people, people of color are most likely to be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which has become very obvious again in our moment of global pandemic, which is not unrelated to climate change either, and looking to things like food justice, which I maybe will talk about later in questions, but thinking about food, how we grow food, how we have access to healthy food, as not just something that we should make sure everyone has the nutrition they need, but thinking about how to end the structural inequities that lead to unequal health outcomes among different groups of people, and how comorbidities emerge in terms of different food-related, diet-related health diseases and susceptibility to other diseases. So just to say, you know, there's a really deep, important history to everything that we're talking about today, and paying attention to where these institutions got built, how these foundations got laid, I think can help us in some ways to think both about turning points, about where moments of change happened and how, and to model sort of today's activism and movements, thinking about history and historical context.
Thank you, Dr. Zeta. That was really informative. You mentioned that the movement kind of sprang up in 1991, but with cases happening before that. I'll say that environmental justice and the topic of, and such topics, I did not become familiar with until I read an article 2 years ago for a research class. And the article was talking about how disproportionately asthma was in Black people living in lower income societies. And I started thinking about that correlation because when I think of the northeast side of Oklahoma City, there are a lot of like dump sites and truck fill up places and things of that nature. And you also throw in the fact that it's a food desert. And so when you start to see these disproportionate kind of like health factors, you can't help but wonder if their geographical location kind of plays a part in that.
Yeah, and because our health is the foundation of, you know, all other abilities and successes in life, you know, it's so important.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Thank you for giving us the history of environmental justice. Very informative. I kind of want to switch gears and discuss environmental justice from a hazards perspective, and I'd like Maggie to take that.
Yes, hi. Well, first I want to thank you all for having me here. Anna, thank you for laying out the history of environmental justice in just 10 minutes, and for sharing that comment from your evaluations. I had to keep myself from laughing because Mother Nature might not be racist, but our systems definitely can be, and I'll get to that more here in a little bit. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And can everybody see okay? Okay, great. So I'm going to keep this as brief as I can because I'm excited to hear from everybody else on this panel and to have a conversation with you all as well as the people tuning in on Facebook. So the perspective that I'm bringing here that I'm going to talk from is from environmental justice and a hazards disasters perspective. But really, there is no one hazard disaster environmental justice perspective. This is just where I'm coming from and is in the tradition of my own training, which is effectively summed up as having two facets. First, that disasters are an inherently social phenomenon. So a triggering event such as hurricane wind, storm surge, or in this case, COVID-19 doesn't necessarily make the disaster, but it's just a source of damage. The disaster occurs in the impact on individual coping patterns that result in disruption to social, economic, and political systems. And a good way to identify a disruption in this regard is to look for adaptations. So I'm sure we all have a list of ways that we've adapted to life in light of COVID-19. For those of us who don't have essential worker positions, that looks like working from home, telehealth services instead of in-person medical visits, the use of face coverings, and so on. And actually, this panel is a kind of a form of an adaptation that we've made in light of COVID-19. We're here streaming live on Facebook, talking to each other on Zoom instead of in person, as I'm sure I personally would have preferred to see all of your faces in front of me. But since disasters are rooted in social structure, their impacts are felt in accordance with those existing structures and how they shape our lives. So vulnerability to disasters reflect weaknesses in social structures or social systems. And vulnerability to disasters is critical when thinking about disaster impacts. So when we consider how a disaster impacts somewhere like Oklahoma, we have to think about the history of Oklahoma, but also weaknesses that are within the social structure or systems that already exist before the disaster strikes. And in the US, something that is embedded into our history, as Anna spoke to, and into our social structure, and thus presents a weakness or vulnerability is inequality, and more specifically, racial inequality caused by racism. And when I'm talking about racism here, I'm referencing less belief, the belief that people have unequal traits, but I'm speaking more to racism as prejudice and discrimination evident in policy that affect people unequally along lines of race. And so vulnerability, though is reflective of social structure, is experienced really personally at the individual level and influenced by individual circumstances that have been shaped by structure as well. And this is where I found, and many have spoken to, the overlap between environmental justice and hazards and disaster research specifically. So environmental justice or inequalities happen when some communities and individuals experience disproportionate environmental burdens, undue environmental burdens, and the process through which this occurs is related to political power, marginalization, things that will shape siting decisions and limit or otherwise influence where people live, such as segregation. And so the same social structure and processes that result in environmental justice concerns shape vulnerability and disaster experiences. So when we're thinking specifically about COVID-19, there are obvious physiological factors that shape vulnerability, but pre-COVID conditions embedded in society can make it more difficult to, for example, protect ourselves or take preventative measures. And this slide right here might look familiar to you. It's from the Oklahoma State COVID What You Should Know page. And here we've seen and heard a lot of this before, but the things that we've all been told to do to limit our risk are things like wash your hands with soap and water. If that's unavailable, use hand sanitizer, avoid touching your face, avoid close contact with people who are sick, and effectively practice social distancing. But the things that are outlined in these orange squares here each get a little more difficult to do when considering things like individual household context, work context, household composition, because there are some folks who might not be able to effectively practice social distancing. For example, if you're in a multi-generational household, right, it's going to be harder to maintain distance between residents if you have an essential job and are an essential worker and have to engage with the public often or in close proximity with other essential workers. Limiting your risk can be more difficult. So work conditions are particularly concerning because these are things that, again, are outside the control of individual workers who are at risk of COVID infection in the workplace. So Texas County in the Panhandle has the third most cases at the county level of COVID in Oklahoma, which is related most closely to an outbreak in a meat packing plant in which working conditions restrict effective social distancing practices. So in terms of those at high risk to COVID-19, we've all heard that older adults and those who have serious chronic medical conditions are at higher risk of getting very sick, right? Chronic medical conditions that are often referenced are things like heart disease, diabetes, lung disease. But chronic disease and poverty are related. Healthcare professionals and health organizations recognize this relationship between socioeconomic status and chronic illness. The World Health Organization released a report on preventing chronic disease where they stated chronic disease and poverty are interconnected in a vicious cycle, right? And they go on to note that chronic disease burden is concentrated among the poor, that poor people are more vulnerable for several reasons, including increased exposure to risk and decreased access to health services, which I think Nancy's going to speak to a little bit later. Chronic disease can also cause poverty in individuals and families and draw folks into this sort of downward spiral of worsening disease and poverty. And Tom Boyce, MD, chief of UCSF's Division of Departmental Medicine, has been quoted as saying that socioeconomic status is the most powerful predictor of disease, disorder, injury, and mortality that we have. In the same vein, race-based inequalities can create circumstances that increase risk of chronic disease. So weathering is a concept that was developed by Arlene Geronimus and speaks to a sense of, or speaks to physiological health erosion from constant stress. And she notes the ways that marginalized people and their communities cope with big and small stressors related to things like socioeconomic status, race, race-based discrimination, especially, can have a heavy toll on the body and on your ability to fight infection, stay well. And I'm going to end on this note. As mentioned at the start, I wanted to keep this really brief, but Arlene Geronimus was recently quoted in a New York Times article saying, the accumulated effects of environmental inequality are compounded by the physiological ramifications of an atmosphere of bias and discrimination, which have been documented to lead to higher rates of poor health outcomes for Black Americans. So Autumn, in your comment after Anna spoke, you said that you started thinking about these connections in Tulsa, right? And these things are definitely related. Environmental justice concerns, health inequalities, and racism within our history and thus our social structure, political processes definitely all interact with one another to disproportionately burden certain members of our populations. And we're seeing that now, and with every disaster. We saw that in Katrina, right? So the hurricane wasn't racist, but our systems are. And we see that evident post-disaster in almost every circumstance. So I'm going to stop my share now and hand it back over to Autumn.
And you mentioned Katrina, and one thing that I took note of during your talk was your mention of the social infrastructure before the disaster. So it's not that Mother Nature is racist, but the infrastructure of these neighborhoods and of these communities before the disaster leads to the ramification, the result that we see afterwards. So I think Hurricane Katrina is the best example to kind of set that stage up and give that imagery of the infrastructure of certain communities before Katrina took place, the levees that weren't properly built to begin with, and how that affected the Black community during that. disasters. So thank you, Maggie. That was a very interesting way of explaining environmental justice from a disasters point of view. So I really appreciate that. Carly, what are some examples or issues that highlight what we've talked about in the context of the Indigenous community?
Yeah, so we've kind of been discussing different kinds of systemic challenges that result in inequalities coming about. And we see those impacting Indigenous communities and tribal populations in a variety of ways. When we're thinking about environmental justice, we think about it in the context of what natural resources exist in tribal areas, who has authority on how to control those natural resources, when those natural resources are used, is there exploitation involved with that extraction activity or other type of usage, and who's left to clean it up, and what type of lingering effects are seen from that. And we see this in a variety of ways. As a Cherokee citizen here in Oklahoma, I've been following the Sequoia Fuels case, and Sarah Hill, who is the Attorney General at Cherokee Nation, had worked on this even before she ascended to that spot. And what had happened was Sequoia Fuels was a uranium processor here, and there was a bunch of leftover hazardous material, and the settlement had indicated Sequoia Fuels was supposed to dispose of that after it had closed. They couldn't find a cost-effective way to do that, so they sent out notice that they were just going to bury it on site. Well, that site is within the Cherokee Nation and is at the confluence of 3 rivers, which from northeastern Oklahoma and the basins that they flow from have the potential to be seriously impacted by uranium leaching, because when it comes to uranium disposal or uranium byproduct disposal, it's not a matter of if it leaks, it's when. Even when you have those protective membranes that go in there, at some point, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, there's going to be a leak at some point. So Sarah Hill was able to work effectively in partnership with the state of Oklahoma to require that settlement agreement to be enforced, and ultimately got all of that leftover uranium removed from the state of Oklahoma and sent to, I believe, a milling plant in Utah, where it was able to be processed to be more radiologically neutral. So without the influence and the participation of the Cherokee Nation protecting their tribal treaty rights with regard to their water usage and their water quality, we probably wouldn't have seen a resolution like that. And that's been consistent. We've seen industry activity that's resulted in leftover pollution that tribes have been on the hook to clean up. So we see that in Cherokee Nation, and we see it especially in the Quapaw Nation in far northeast Oklahoma as a result of the Superfund site there. In Pitcher, Oklahoma, which is where the mining activities occurred, where you've got those big chat piles that were very detrimental to the area and ultimately caused Pitcher to become an abandoned town because of the Superfund status. Quapaw Nation has had to work very closely with the EPA in order to secure enough funds and bring matching funds to the table to do the cleanup necessary. And Quapaw has been very invested in their agricultural activity, and they were able to leverage some of those funds to do thorough topsoil replacement, and are now converting that previously contaminated site to do food production on that. So the good part about it is tribes are willing to do the work, where we see places where maybe the state or non-tribal governments are not able to interject appropriately, or our federal government doesn't have the resources or the political will to do the work. But we see tribal communities stepping in, and that's not really their responsibility, because they aren't the ones that caused the pollution. They aren't the ones that caused the waste, but for some reason they're left holding the bag when it comes to cleanup efforts. And that's not just, consistent with tribes in Oklahoma. We see that in Navajo Nation with regard to the uranium mining that's seen out there that's caused significant pollution, especially in their water resources. And we also see that in the Havasupai tribes near the Grand Canyon, where uranium mining has been a particular concern. And all of those go towards impacting the natural resources from a soil and water perspective, and how that impacts the ability for these tribes to engage in food sovereignty and support their own people through food systems. Now, if you have, land that's available, but it's polluted, who wants to eat food that's been grown off of it, especially if you're not sure if that, plant product or livestock that you're running isn't pulling the pollution out of the soil. Now, there are some more natural remediation opportunities that are available, and a lot of tribes are exploring hemp as the possibility to plant because hemp does draw a lot of those heavy metals out of the soil, but we don't know how long it's going to take for full remediation to occur. We don't know the cost to do it in an effective and efficient manner from a time frame perspective. And then we also see on the flip side, corporate agriculture when it comes in. Here in northeastern Oklahoma, especially in Delaware County, Cherokee Nation has a lot of allotted land up there. So to backtrack a little bit, removed tribes that have come to Oklahoma, that there's most of them were removed to Oklahoma from other places. But when we're talking about the Cherokee Nation, Chickasaw Nation, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, and Choctaw Nation, those tribes went through allotment processes. So the parcels were broken up and assigned to individual tribal members in the early 1900s. And some of those areas remain allotted, which means they're under the direct control of the tribe rather than being under the control of the state. So once they fall out of this, what's called allotted status, it's called a fee status, and then that goes under the authority of the state. So there are a lot of these allotted parcels that still remain and exist in Delaware County. And we've seen a proliferation of corporate poultry houses coming in up there. And the pollution that comes off of these poultry houses is significant from an air pollution perspective with ammonia, and then also from a water pollution perspective. And the water pollution perspective is a little bit nuanced because it has to do with the usage. These poultry houses use a lot of water, and the aquifers that they draw from, the more water they use, the less recharge those aquifers get. And when you see that lack of quantity of water, we don't get the same water quality because that recharge requires a certain volume of water for all the pollution or other types of particulates or sediments that come in there for it to be resolved. And, you know, we like to use the cute little phrase, you know, the solution to pollution is dilution when it comes to water, but we're not seeing that. And so those tribal populations of peoples that have been on these owned and lived on these allotted parcels since pre-statehood has been incredibly detrimental to the ability of them to live and work and run their own agriculture operations in competition with some of the pollution challenges they've seen from this poultry house proliferation. And when we see corporations coming in and seeking to make use of tribal resources, whether it's land or water or, you know, air, whatever it is, a lot of times they'll seek to locate in rural, poor tribal regions, tempting the tribes with jobs partnerships or other sorts of opportunities like a tribal hiring preference in order to kind of smooth over with the tribe and prevent them from having recourse against that corporation because of that pre-existing partnership. And it leaves the citizens kind of surrounded and on their own as far as how to fight that and challenge it. We've seen some successful pushback through recognizing these when they come up and identify them. Tribal peoples are becoming much more savvy about identifying, looking down the road and saying, you know, we may get a short-term benefit from it, from jobs creation, but what's the long-term cost? Who's going to be on the hook for remediation? Who's going to be covering up when we don't have enough water to serve our peoples, or when the air pollution is so bad that we can't even step outside and breathe? So we see a lot of different ways that kind of impacts tribal communities from an environmental perspective. And then all of that directly ties into the ability to have food sovereignty, because if you don't have good quality resources to produce food, you're not going to be able to. And tribal agriculture is incredibly important, especially if we've seen with COVID-19 disruptions in our food systems, because we don't have a local or regional resiliency in place or redundancy in place. We're so dependent upon this national just-in-time food system that when we see those disruptions, we see a very quick crumbling that backs up and impacts things further out on the chain. So whether it's a transportation holdup, whether people in processing plants are getting too sick to come to work, and producers are having a large volume of livestock that would be otherwise ready for processing, and they're having to either give it away or euthanize in order to manage those populations, that's directly impactful, especially for tribal communities, because 200 years of federal Indian policy have resulted in tribes being underdeveloped from an ag and food systems perspective, and also heavily reliant on federal nutrition programs. And across tribal nations, we've seen an average of about an 11% increase for those nutrition programs, whether it's SNAP or whether it's the food distribution program on Indian reservations. And some tribal locations have had up to a 50% increase. So if you can imagine, more than 50% of people that were receiving services are coming and saying, we need help, we need access to these commodity foods, we need access to food stamps in order to be able to feed our families because we've lost our jobs. That is huge for Indian country. And I'm sure there's other parts of the United States that have seen increases like that, but it is particularly noticeable in Indian country. And if you're looking for a blatant example of where our food systems are failing or where we have brokenness or challenges in that, you need look no further than Indian country from that perspective.
Carly, you talked a lot about agriculture and how it pertains to Indigenous communities. And Dr. Zeta, I definitely want to hear from you after we speak with Nancy about food injustice and how it impacts the larger community outside of the tribal folks. So now we're going to go to Nancy. And Nancy, I'd like for you to expand on local examples or issues that we've highlighted so far within the context of Tulsa. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for that.
Well, I don't see my PowerPoint, which is fine at this point, but I wanted to make some comments on before I do see it. I was in the Facebook group Save Our States when listening to Governor Stitt talk about the fact that, well, he was asked, is there going to be any accounting for race on COVID-19 stats? And he said he didn't see any reason for that. Of course, I started yelling at the computer. And because, it's, we have seen many reports in cities throughout the country where show that African Americans and brown folks and also Native Americans have been disproportionately affected by COVID. And when I made a comment, someone also asked me, how can a virus be racist? And it really has to do with, the host response. If we have pre-existing conditions, if we're, exposed to environmental toxins, air toxins, if we don't have access to health care, if we live in substandard housing, our readiness for our body to mount, a defense against something as virulent as the COVID-19 virus is very challenged. And in terms of Oklahoma, Tulsa, what I read most recently is that 23% of our cases, at least a few days ago, were among Latinx community who represent 10% of our population. So, and then in terms of the coverage of environmental of air pollution in its relationship to COVID-19, it was very underreported. So when mayors were asked about the disproportionate, effect of COVID on people of color, air pollution didn't come up, even though some studies have revealed that the counties with the highest amounts of air pollution have some of the highest rates of COVID infection. So I was fortunate enough to be chosen as a fellow with the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, and one of 3 in our EPA district and a region. And I think the great thing about it, aside from studying these issues, just reading about online, having conversations, is that this fellowship allowed me to go directly into communities and talk to people about the effects of toxic air pollution on their quality of life and their health. And that has been very meaningful for me. I live around 41st and Riverside. I see the refinery across the way, never really ventured over there, and didn't have a reason to. And when I did, for the first time during last year's flood, the air was just horrific. And, I came back with a scratchy throat, and I just thought, what would it be like to live there all the time? So next slide, please. I'm also a co-coordinator of the Ready for 100 campaign, which is a nationwide campaign to convince city officials and municipalities to transition to 100% renewable energy to power all our needs, electricity by 2035, and all other energy sectors, transportation, heating, by renewable energy by 2050. So next. So let's talk about Tulsa a little bit. Tulsa's, is challenged. We're the 23rd most challenging place to live in the U.S. if you have allergies, and allergies are on the rise due to climate change because, when we have excessive CO2 in our atmosphere, that causes plants to release more pollen. So people are getting more miserable. Sometimes, it's said that people aren't going to respond to climate change unless it directly affects them. But maybe those of you with itchy eyes and headaches, might wake up to the fact that it is happening now and affecting you. And it's also the 37th most challenging place to live with asthma. Here in Tulsa, asthma rates are highest on the north side and the west side of Tulsa. And let's go on. And recently, the American Lung Association State Air Report they do annual ratings, and we got an F for ozone. And ozone is basically smog, and it's formed from a chemical reaction of nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds in the presence of heat and sunlight. And so today, yesterday and tomorrow, I do believe we will be at people who are, are more vulnerable to air pollution, those with cardiovascular disease, lung disease, elderly, children will be at greater risk because of ozone pollution. And ozone is something we've been battling, for decades. Next, please. And part of the reason is that, we are a state that is very dominated by the oil and gas industry. So this slide, it's very detailed, but you can see at the very bottom that the Tulsa-Muskogee-Bartlesville region is the 12th most impacted metropolitan area in terms of health by ozone pollution. And next. And this is a slide that from oh gosh, I can't see the publication Trouble in the Air. And this was from 2018, and in 2018, Tulsa had the fourth highest numbers of days when air was unhealthy because of the presence of what's called PM 2.5 or particulate matter, which are just tiny little particles of pollution, less than 1/30 the width of size of hair. It's we can breathe it into our lungs. It easily goes in our bloodstream. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It is associated with premature death, all kinds of diseases. Air pollution affects us, I like to say, from our bones to our brain. There's no part of our body that's not affected. And and although I didn't have a slide, the EPA showed that in 46 out of 50 states, African Americans breathe air that's contaminated by PM 2.5 at greater rates than white Americans. And part of the reason we had such high PM 2.5 this year is because of wildfires, and we are at greater risk. This slide is an interesting. You can maybe take a look at this screen yourself. Screening tool yourself. Going on these sites are pretty complicated, but what this shows is you can see the dark purple. Those are areas where these industries have high toxic scores. Those toxic scores are calculated by the number of pounds of toxic chemicals are released times their toxicity. Some toxics are they're more dangerous than others, and times the amount of people affected. So you can see from this map over on West Tulsa and North Tulsa the east side of Tulsa by the airport. You know, and the interesting thing, and I hate, sometimes I hate using that word interesting, because it's not just interesting, it's disgraceful that you know, some of the, if you can go on to each of these individual companies, you'll see that their toxic scores are actually higher than the median scores of companies, you know, within their industry. So next, please. And this is just something, you know, I just want to introduce to you. If you ever want to look up the environmental justice screening tool, you can type in your address and you can learn what kind of facilities are near you. Those that have to report to the EPA for toxic water or air emissions, brownfields. You can look in terms of, you know, the demographics of the folks, schools nearby, low-income housing nearby, and it's a great tool to learn more. So my role, my project was going out and interviewing people door to door that live nearby the Hollow refinery. And we interviewed 110 people. Also did this in the Heights and in Crosby Heights, which I can't really discuss now. It's too much time. So fence line communities, those communities that are right next to an oil and gas facility, and they're impacted, you know, by noise, odor, traffic, you know, diesel trucks going in and out, chemical emissions. And most of these same communities are populated by low-income individuals and community of color. And there's just not a lot of environmental, a lot of other economic opportunities or, you know, good things happen in the community that adds to their quality of life. Next. So Holly Frontier East and West were named by the Political Economy Research Institute, which is housed out of the University of Massachusetts, as the top 100 air toxic emitter and number 78 in water toxins emitted. And this institute uses the same toxic score, where you look at what's released, how toxic it is, how many people, how far it spreads, and who's exposed. So 44% of the people exposed were identified as Hispanic or non-white, and 24% live below the poverty level, which is higher than, you know, our national poverty level. Next. So these are a couple pictures I took, and it's, you know, I call that little park there on, you know, the saddest little park in Tulsa. You know, not only is it right next to the refinery, but it's right alongside the highway. The soccer field there is next to the refinery, but the picture on the top right is a cement batch mixing plant, Delis. And I looked them up, and they were cited several of the last years since 2012 for having to report for excess lead emissions. This tells you a little bit about where the PM2 emitters are, and you can see over there on the, you know, on the right or left, you know, on the West Tulsa and also East Tulsa and a little bit on North Tulsa. But so it's kind of a toxic stew of chemicals. So we asked people, do you have a problem with the air quality in your neighborhood? 80% said yes, and in the Heights and Crosby, it was over 90%. How often does it smell bad? It's, you know, upwards towards like 85%, either frequently or occasionally. And how are people affected? And this was very disturbing. You know, first of all, they don't like the way it stinks. And anytime you smell something bad, it's a source of environmental stress. You wonder, what am I breathing if it's unhealthy? And it actually triggers protective responses in the body, because the body's like, there's something wrong. This is a signal that I could be hurt, and so it produces inflammation. The irritation to eyes, nose, and throat, 43%. Triggers asthma, breathing problems, 1/3. Avoid going outside, not allowing the children to go outside. We heard some just awful stories. And of course, it seemed very obvious to most people that it was the oil refineries that were causing, and there's 2 on the west side there. And just to keep in mind too that this is an area where City of Tulsa and HUD are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in new housing over there. And some of the people asked me, like, I don't understand why they're doing this. It's not livable. like I wouldn't move here. And when I lived on the east side, or I lived in the south side, I never had a sore throat. Like, why are they doing this? And some of them were very suspicious that, for now, people wanted to have that riverfront property, that the gathering place was there. And so 88% felt like people should take, that the city council should take action. And some of the ideas presented were planting more trees, enacting stricter pollution controls, attracting clean energy businesses, energy efficiency. So they had a lot of ideas. And this was very heartbreaking to me. One woman who lived directly across from the refinery, she asked us to ask the city officials, make it smell better for us poor folks. And next slide, please. So finally, I have my hands in a lot of different pots, and trying to just get more folks who I know are concerned, and I know they're out there. We know there's a problem and we need to help us, but there's some really great opportunities right now. Tulsa is about to engage in a process of reviewing our comprehensive plan, and within that plan, it says we have a goal to become a leader in sustainability, carbon neutrality, and to provide incentives for energy efficiency. So we want to make sure that we hold the city of Tulsa's feet to the fire, and that they fulfill these goals. And last review was 4 years ago, and there had been no action in these areas. The Tulsa Sustainability Plan came out in 2021. It pretty much stayed on the shelf. So many great ideas, so many wonderful community volunteers and civil servants who worked on this. And we shouldn't let all that effort, all that go to naught. Oh, I think, am I over my 10 minutes?
Oh, no, I just.
That would be hard to do.
No, I was just.
Yeah, so we have opportunities here in Tulsa to increase community engagement on these topics, such as having a climate action plan, making sure that part of our affordable housing services include energy efficiency. And we have a voice, and I think we can make some noise, and that we can be heard in numbers. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Nancy. I love the way that you summed up the ways that the air quality and the environment is point blank affecting certain individuals in the community. But one thing that stood out to me was you said Tulsa was the 23rd most challenging place to live with allergies. And one of my best friends flew to Oklahoma from Michigan, and she got off the plane, and her eyes were gray, watering. I mean, she literally thought she was dying. And it turns out it was just her allergies. But
was that in Oklahoma City?
Yes, it was in Oklahoma City.
Oklahoma City's worse.
Yes, and so and it was so funny because we were calling optometrists. Her eyesight was really messed up. We were planning on taking her to an eye doctor, but it just turned out to be allergies. And so when you mentioned that, it kind of made me think of that story about just how her allergies were triggered within 2 hours of stepping foot in the state. So that is a major problem that you just broke down so well. I know we're getting close on the hour, but I have a couple of questions to pose to the panelists. First, I wanted to ask, how do you see these issues of environmental justice being heightened in this moment of a global pandemic, being that we are in the wake of COVID-19? And I'm going to pose that to anyone that wants to answer.
Well, I'll say a word about food justice in this moment, very much connecting to what Carly was talking about. But I'm, certainly in the indigenous communities and across the U.S. as a whole, you're just seeing, I think, this moment where things that had been invisible are being made visible in all different kinds of ways. And for me, someone who studies kind of the business and supply system side of a lot of the way our food system has been built, it's been really fascinating to see people discovering for the first time, not only that there's police brutality, but also that, our food may not show up in our grocery stores if the supply chains that lead them to get there are broken. If there are massive outbreaks of COVID-19 in slaughterhouses and food processing facilities, which we're seeing so much of because of who's deemed essential workers and because of these other issues we've been talking about throughout the hour, if you have, as we do, kind of two supply chains set up, one directed to consumers and one directed to institutions, and those institutions are not buying as much in this moment, then you have this entire stream of food that's being wasted, being destroyed, and that can't be repurposed to go into consumer markets in the same way. So all of these things that exist behind the scenes of all of the way that our society operates until this moment has been invisible. And now that the visibility, I think, as depressing as it is, and as much as it brings all of us an awareness of a lot of tragedy and injustice around, a lot of people are also talking about the opportunity that this poses to take this recognition and do something with it, that perhaps a kind of public eye-opening and public reckoning of all of these problems that exist and are indeed interwoven may make space for change, which in some respects we're seeing small pieces of. So I find some small piece of hope amid all of this, and think that, I don't know, maybe Maggie could speak to this too, but how disasters do make us stop, business as usual to think about what else could be.
Yeah, I think that with picking it up there, I think that there's been so much wide scale disruption and impacts from COVID specifically that we've reached a point and are going to keep running into this issue of having to reconceptualize how to move forward in a more just way across the board, because you can't, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, as I think we all alluded to, it's all related, right? It's like you can't just silo and focus on one issue, right? Public health is related to environmental justice and environmental degradation, and those things are also related and influenced by systematic inequalities.
Well, before we go, does anyone have any lasting thoughts or lasting statements to make? Okay, well, that about wraps up our time. Again, a big thank you to each of the participants on the panel, and thank you to those tuning in to today's Real Talk on environmental justice. Please tune in June 20th for our next Real Talk on COVID-19 and voting rights. If you would like to learn more about the Tri-City Collective, I encourage you to visit our website, www.tricitycollective.com. Also, like us on Facebook and Instagram by following us at Tri-City Collective OK. Have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you guys for tuning in. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.